I'd like to start by just asking really, difficult, awful questions. So start with you, Gabriel. How much housing is enough? How much do we need to build? And how soon?
Yeah, how much housing do we need? Well, as you all might imagine, it's impossible to answer, really. We have a guesstimate, which is that if San Francisco added at least 5,000 units a year on average for many years in a row, that would stabilize housing costs. And over time, as incomes go up, housing would begin to become gradually more affordable. That's our best guess.
Great. My next question would be this. So you spoke very eloquently of the need. Yes, we're passing it down the line. Okay. Sorry, here. I didn't know. I heard eloquent. You spoke very eloquently of the need to really bring into the center of our concern those communities which are being least well served in our city, and to recognize that things are getting even worse. So how much do you think the city can do there? How much can the people of the city and its government do to address deep entrenched problems like that? You spoke about changing how we think about governance. What does that mean?
I think alone we can't do very much, but in collaboration we can do an awful lot. I mean, I mentioned, my wife is an occupational therapist. I mean, she encounters children who are over-identified, Black and Latino kids, routinely over-identified for special education, for example. These are kids who are experiencing trauma, right? We need to train our teachers in how to deal with children who face trauma and not identify them as special education and put them on the wrong track. So frankly, they don't get to City College because they drop out, because they've been misidentified, because we don't know how to train our teachers to deal with these students appropriately. I was at an event on Monday, the My Brother's Keeper initiative the president started. I have to admit, I'm very optimistic by Mayor Lee, by the district superintendent, by the multitude of organizations and entities in the room. But none of them alone is going to find a solution. It's about changing systematically how we address intergenerationally, again, how we address the parent and the child and the grandparent in many cases at the same time. And that's going to require sustained long-term intervention. It's not just, we're not going to hack it, right?
And what is the vehicle for that? How do you see that happening?
I think the vehicles are through places. As much as I am a political scientist, so I look at these, similarly, like everything gets solved with these broad global forces. But I mean, the world is on the one hand, it's these bigger global forces, but then the problems are being addressed at the hyper-local level. So how do we take programs like Hope SF, which is trying to revision public housing, and ensure that we then coordinating across the school district, early childhood education, we're training teachers better, we're providing, we work with School of Law, School of Nursing, School of Health Professions at the university. How can we bring all the resources from our institution in combination with these various entities, nonprofits, and build the capacity of the community to address its own issues?
Right.
I think we have to have that level of commitment to a long-term, deeply resourced and an integrated approach to address these issues.
Great, thank you. So Sarah, you were talking about the middle class, and it seems to me that one of the sort of unaddressed realities of our current situation is that when you look at who we can best serve for providing housing through the private sector, through the public sector building affordable housing, through various nonprofit kinds of interventions, there is a group in the middle that will sort of be the last served, right? Least able to buy into expensive and least sort of considered eligible for help. Given that that's the case, how do we possibly prevent the loss of the middle class from San Francisco? What could we possibly do to address that issue?
So probably the biggest ones are ones that have been said by other. Transportation. Not everybody's going to live in these 7 square miles. Absolutely. So if we can have their presence during the workday and they go home somewhere else, but we still have that input into the city, that matters. Education, huge one. We all know how many people leave the city at kindergarten or whatever we have. And that carries all the way through. The one I work on, housing, is I think the most challenging of that trifecta. I think, and this is something you mentioned when you talked about how we need to change the paradigm of how we look at our housing. We're seeing some of that shift in San Francisco. I think there is a cadre of people whose household, who are approaching childbearing age, who want to stay in the city, and who are looking at things like home ownership differently. They don't need a home where that's appreciation and that's where they put all their money. I mean, one of the things we're exploring, and I'm really interested to see if it works, is can we do deed restricted housing for middle income, moderate and middle income families? Will they
You just
accept
explain what that is.
when we permanently restrict the price of a home and peg it to someone's income? And the reason they may not do that is when you sell it, it has to be sold to a person at a similar income. So the appreciation you see is nowhere near the appreciation that we're seeing in our wacky market. It means that housing is not an investment vehicle. It is simply housing. But I think there's some take up for that. And it's not everyone, and the American dream is still what it is. But in terms of how we're shifting towards the future, there's enough people that believe in cities and want to live the life that they offer, and they're willing to change the way they look at what housing is and what a house means and how they use it. So
And how can the city better facilitate that kind of innovation?
money is one of them. And I will say, you know, I talked a lot about political will and advocacy, and I hate to beat this drum too loud, but every time that someone lops 2 stories off of a housing project, every time somebody says affordable housing isn't a good fit for our neighborhood, there are families who lose. The really hard part about that is those families are unidentified, and the families who are saying not here are identified and very clear. So I do think for us to be able to build those units to offer subsidy towards, you know, places that we aren't, not just our public housing and our very low, but other classes of people, we need the voices to be heard. We need advocacy out there. I need them to, you know, in City Hall to raise that support.
Great, thanks. So let's discuss advocacy for a second. We live in a city in an area with a tremendous amount of political passion, obviously, and with a deep history of progressive politics. Having grown up in a commune, I can tell you this is nothing new. And at the same time, we have not yet seemed to ever really fully bring together that level of passion and commitment to progressive values with governance that actually responds at the scale that that we need it to on any number of problems, right? There's always been a sort of a gap between passion and governance. What do you think activists need to learn in order to change that?
Well, on the most basic level, I know this will sound something straight out of the Ralph Nader, Michael Moore playbook, but we need to get money out of politics. I mean, if what social movements have to contribute to a city, to a nation, to a state, are to be translated into political will, they have to have an equal playing field with people who have a lot of advantages and a lot of privileges right now. So campaign finance reform is part of it, but also part of it is the experiments. When you win something good, that you also have the second demand of building experiments in local governments here, like the San Francisco Community Land Trust does, like the different experiments around local decentralized decision making, so people actually have a voice. I do not fetishize decentralization because it can also lead into NIMBYism, but there's a balance there.
And if you were going to recommend to folks who may or may not have a very deep grounding necessarily in the issues as they're playing out in the community, if you're going to recommend something to an experience to go have, what would you say is the first step?
Well, I think the walking tours that Chris Carlson, one of our best public intellectuals in San Francisco, does are really great, because you actually really find that behind almost everything that's interesting in San Francisco, there was a social movement behind it. Right, and I think just avail yourself of that, because it's there, it's accessible, it's very affordable. You find out that just right up the street at Broadway and Sansom, homeless people basically took to the streets to make sure that that affordable family housing was actually built, and then the advocacy of Chinatown Community Development Center made sure that families who are living in residential hotels, I want to say that again, families living in residential hotels could exit that into dignified housing. That was at least a 3-year struggle. Actually, probably more like a 10-year struggle, and it involved taking over housing. It involved voting. It involved lobbying, and it was messy, but a lot was won.
Thank you. Enrico, is gentrification bad?
Should ask Gabe. what's bad is not the fact that we're adding 20,000 jobs per year. What's bad is the fact that we're not building enough units to accommodate those workers. So gentrification is a fairly predictable outcome of deliberate policy choices. And in some sense, the sad thing about the state of affair is the fact that some of the activism that have made San Francisco culturally rich and more viable have also played a role in this. I think that a lot of the extreme left has a big role. Have played a big role by restricting housing, aligning itself with NIMBYs, and I think the renters of San Francisco, the 65% of citizens who rent, are the losers in this process. And I think that this is an example where activism actually, well-intentioned activism, has actually had perverse effect in the long run. And I think the renters are the main loser of this equation.
Gabe, Gabriel. So tell me, NIMBYs. They seem like the immovable force of San Francisco politics. Can you imagine a post-NIMBY civic culture?
Does everybody know this word? Not in my backyard. Not in my backyard. The acronym NIMBY. It is the thing that explains the predicament that we're in as much as anything else. Something's gone very wrong in the culture of progressivism here in the Bay Area, that people can think of themselves as a good liberal and still think it's acceptable to tell other people that they can't move here. Something's gone wrong. I do think that we have to find some very respectful and loving ways to challenge those attitudes and not allow them to sort of exist peacefully. I actually think observing our sister city to the north, Seattle, which I think has many similar dynamics to San Francisco, a big tech boom, surrounded by water. They've managed to build much, much more housing and thereby keep their housing a bit more affordable than we have. And I believe something happened in the 1990s where it became socially unacceptable for people to say in public that they opposed infill development in their neighborhood. And that cultural change is what we need to try to lead the way to that gently but firmly here in San Francisco.
So you, we're gonna go back around. You spoke about social movements. Some have argued that we need a new set of urban social movements, which have to do with dealing with big structural changes that have been left undone, right? So people talk about housing, the provision of housing. People talk about new infrastructure. People talk about climate and climate emissions and the need for cities to address that, something I've written about. All of these things are not like previous movements in that they are not just about a no. Right? In fact, often there's not a simple no to point at, right? If somebody's, bulldozing affordable housing, it's very easy to go, don't do that, right? If somebody's discriminating against somebody, it's very easy to say, don't do that. It's harder though, when you have something where you're saying, let's address this complex question, this complex set of issues in a way that produces better outcome. What do we want? So, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about what social movements might look like and what kind of a civic culture might be created in order to actually tackle really complex questions. That was the longest question I think anybody has ever delivered. So,
and I'm trying to figure out a way of making it a yes or no, so I can. True. This is where I usually just in class turn to a PowerPoint and change the subject. So unfortunately. I think it's about building our civic infrastructure. I think the answer to that is I'm not sure it's that different from past movements, to be honest with you. And I think it's about how do we build our civic infrastructure. I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of energy around immigrants' rights movements, right? I mean, it's no longer about, at least in San Francisco as it plays out. I mean, so I have pretty fundamental questions about what sort of city we want to be, right? Before, in the 1900s, we had a model of immigration that said everybody who comes here, however they get here, is a future citizen, and they're to be integrated economically, politically, and socially. We didn't have citizen restrictions on who could vote. 40 states allowed anyone to vote if they were residents, didn't have citizen requirements. We, on the other hand, had citizens who weren't allowed to vote, right? African Americans, women, people who weren't property holders. But citizenship wasn't a barrier or wasn't a prerequisite to voting in a lot of jurisdictions. That's a relatively new phenomenon that came up in the 1920s, and again with Chinese exclusion and things like that we saw in San Francisco and other jurisdictions. The question I think we have in San Francisco is a complex one, but it's how do we as a city say that we are, our value is that of the city of St. Francis. And while we may have an ordinance which is probably the most immigrant-friendly ordinance in the country about language access for non-English speakers, what does it mean when we hear from organizations in the city that there are women who have experienced domestic violence who go into a police office and can't be served by police officers who don't have language training, right? Or what does it mean when they're deal with a school situation where the teacher, again, may over-identify for special education or don't comprehend the trauma that unaccompanied youth who've come here from other places are experiencing? San Francisco Unified, to their great credit, accepted all these students. What we didn't do is provide the training and the framework for teachers to effectively educate those students.
So what you're saying is the yes here would be an
yes here
inclusive
is if
system.
we can agree as a community, again, as I think we have historically, and I sort of agree with Gabriel about what sort of city we are and what it means to be the city of St. Francis, then we need to then have a further conversation about how we live that practice.
Great. Sarah, let me ask you. This is a room full of smart people with resources and access and abilities to do things. In terms of addressing these kinds of questions, housing, transportation, social justice, what could a room like this do to help make the city's job of addressing these issues easier and more realistic to aim higher? What kind of civic input could a room of people like this have?
Change the conversation. I think the conversation in most cities, in all politics, is driven by the most in crisis and the loudest. And I think what that leaves out is the rest of the balance. And I talked about the barbell, and I think we have a conversation rightly focused on how are we going to rebuild some of our dilapidated public housing into true communities that have services, that have education facilities on site, that have opportunities for work. Those are great things. We need a lot of money to pull them off, and it's going to take some time, but the conversation is there. I will say, and I feel pretty proud of this, we have a very robust pipeline of low-income affordable housing out there. We will build 10,000 units by 2020 of new affordable housing, including the rebuilds that we're doing. But I think we're starting to hear this conversation in the noise about evictions that have grown louder over the last 2 years. That's important. This year, evictions have declined. At the same time, I think the conversation has grown louder. Those are both good things. That's how we get them to decline even further. If we can extend that conversation to look at our larger spectrum of families and families staying in the city, families who are contributing to our public schools and making them not, so they have a balance of children and population in them. If we can change the conversation so people are talking about building housing for everyone and see what Gabe said, that when you say no to housing, you're excluding certain families. If we can change that conversation, I feel like it will make a large difference. I think what is hard about that, and this is a real challenge to you guys, is how do you get people who are not in crisis to advocate like they are? And I think that's the problem. It's, when you're not in a crisis, if you can choose Oakland, if you have alternatives, you're too busy, and that's what you do. And if we can change the conversation so that advocacy happens before people are in crisis, I think that will help move the actions within City Hall to respond to that.
Pre-crisis advocacy. What do you think?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that the San Francisco, whether or not you are personally impacted by the very worst of the crisis, is in a crisis, and we should just recognize that 100%. You know, the great James Baldwin said, you know, if they come for you in the morning, they'll be back for me at night. And you know, for a lot of people, it's night already, and a lot of people it's 3 in the afternoon. A lot of people it's bright and early in the morning, and they have no problems. But it's about building the type of political coalitions for, you know, for grassroots economic development that unites the person who is sleeping in a cardboard box with the working class family that is struggling to stay in their rental in the Excelsior. That's the type of political coalitions that we need to build for More for All.
Great. I'm going to ask you the last word, and then we're going to maybe open it up a little bit. Are we going to do that? Okay. So give me the business case for addressing housing, transportation, and social justice. Like, why should people whose real concern is the bottom line, who are concerned with the economics of the area, why should they care?
Labor costs. Right now, when you look at workers in San Francisco, they are some of the most expensive workers in the world. However, they're also some of the most productive and innovative workers in the world. So right now, it's actually still a good deal. If you are an innovative company, this area is still a good deal. And that's why this area is growing. But if you keep pushing it, by not building houses and by not building transportation infrastructure, it comes a point where the labor cost is not justified based on the productivity and the degree of innovation of the labor force. And so all these themes are actually, should definitely resonate with local employers, because it comes a point where, and we see it happening in history of cities over and over again, right? So it's not like, you know, Detroit used to be the Silicon Valley of the 50s. There wasn't a larger creator of patents and R&D investment than Detroit in the 50s. And so there are many reasons why Detroit failed, but certainly there were a lot of choices a little poor choice in terms of labor cost that cost a lot of employment there. Here, the issues are obviously housing and transportation. I would actually underscore transportation as a major. We tend to think about San Francisco as a city. The reality is that this is a region. The same way that Manhattan is just one piece of the entire New York area, San Francisco is just one piece of the entire metro area. Now, the difference is that Manhattan has 4 additional boroughs, and here it's just one city. So it's much easier to think about San Francisco isolated. But the reality is that most of the workforce of Manhattan doesn't live in Manhattan. And I think that looking forward, most of the workforce of San Francisco might not necessarily live in San Francisco. But if we provide an affordable, efficient transportation infrastructure, public transportation infrastructure, I'm talking about buses and subways that work, that's a win-win for everybody. And again, I think this is a case where our city, which supposedly is so progressive, turns out to be not so progressive, because we haven't really invested in transportation infrastructure. Look at Muni. I mean, if any of you guys have taken Muni, it's a disgrace. And this is a case where investment in that type of public service would benefit the workers, would benefit employers, and would benefit everybody else who drives and has less. So it's a win-win-win situation, and yet we're not doing it.
Great, thank you. So I want to open it up for questions. The way I'd like to do this is to have people stand up and ask questions, and we'll have a few asked, and then we'll have a discussion here about those questions in total rather than one by one. Does that make sense to everyone? So basically, just go ahead and ask your questions. Who wants to start us off here? Yes.
Hi. Do you think the Presidio could ever be used for high-density affordable housing?
Okay, the question was, could the Presidio ever be used for high-density affordable housing? Next question. No, we're doing it this way.
One of the things that I think a lot of us like most about San Francisco is the diversity of culture and the opportunity to touch it. At the same time, when I think about development, I think about things that come along with it, and that's responsible for a lot of the public art we see. And I wonder if the city has considered things like And I'll circle back real quickly. One of the things that's great about battery powered is it takes people with opportunity and brings them to the issue so that we learn about exactly what's going on. And so I wonder, if it's feasible to, instead of having public art as a requirement of building the Salesforce Tower, a floor has to be available for early childhood education. And another floor has to be made available to the Mission Dance Theater, which is about to be priced out of its neighborhood where it's been for 30 years simply because of rent.
Okay, so other ways of using developer requirements. Who else has a question? Yes, can you shout it out? Whoa, okay, can you pick the best?
I'm a student of economics, so I know consumer and producer surplus, so I think that at some point, we need to address that. Second, we have a lot of have and have nots in the city, which has definitely been addressed today in the conversation. But if you change a lot of things in the city, the haves are gonna definitely experience suffering. So I think that also needs to kind of be addressed a bit, because no one really wants something, I think, really to change in some ways if you're a have. And there was a great article in TechCrunch about 6 to 7 months ago. I don't know, I'm sure all of you read it. It was 47 pages. It was a really good article that went back in the 70s, starting with Nancy Pelosi's decision. But it's a good philosophical, understanding of the situation. Now,
I do want to encourage you to wander towards the question if that's where you're headed.
how do you address that? Have and have not. You haven't really. And the third one is schools. We haven't addressed the school issue here in San Francisco relative to other schools in the nation that are that cosmopolitan. And the final thing I have to say is accountability. How are we going to measure progress?
Okay, well, so that's 6 questions in total. Why don't we start there? So let's start with the easy one, the Presidio. How do we make that happen? Who wants to say that we can, and how would we do it? Anyone, jump in.
So I'm holding the mic because I'm in the middle, and I will just say, as the one who probably knows the city regulations the best, legally, that one we probably can't. But you raise a good question. The Presidio Trust has a lot of regulations on it. The question of, can we use some of our open spaces, a little more dynamically has come up. It's a tough question, and I don't think we've seen much political will to go very far on that. I think a more feasible solution is saying in the places where we can rebuild, where we have one-story buildings, and we've got dozens of them. I mean, we don't need to take up the Presidio land if we rebuild those, and we look at density on those sites.
Great. Anyone have another answer to that specific issue?
No, I'd like to take the schools piece if that's okay.
We'll come back to the schools piece. We'll get there. So let's talk about the issue of the suffering of the haves for a second. I'm not sure that necessarily is how we might put it in a sort of more public forum, but let's take the intent of the question and say that there are people who have things the way they want them now and are opposed to change. Certainly this is a dynamic in our city. What, if anything, should we be thinking about in terms of how to make that better? Is that something that should concern us properly? Anyone want to take that on?
Yeah, respectfully, I don't think any of the solutions or ideas that's been put forward by any of the panelists are actually going to cause the haves to suffer quite a bit. They might have to pay a little bit more in taxes, certainly not as much as Northern European cities, but it's all very, very possible with the mechanisms that we have now. Ironically, a lot of these ideas like transportation, like bolstering schools, like building enough affordable housing, actually builds a more robust cultural base for all San Franciscans. So I really don't see the suffering of the haves as something that's in the near future of San Francisco.
Okay. Let me ask about rent control, and Gabriel, maybe you could take this one, or anyone can jump in. So we have rent control. Are we likely to see it go away? Are we likely to see it dramatically increase? Or are we likely just to see some version of what we have now with all its problems?
rent, as you used your words very carefully. Rent control is an issue, I think you said. It is. Here's the thing. We did something really smart in our rent control ordinance. It does not apply to new development. So it actually does not discourage additions to housing supply. So I think that there's sort of two paradigms you can think about rent control in. One paradigm is we're going to let the market work. And in that case, we're going to not have rent control. But what has to go along with that is we have to also not have zoning. Because if you are going to limit the supply of housing through law, you have to also limit the price through law, which is rent control. If you keep zoning, meaning so you keep the law preventing, the law is limiting the additions of supply, it would be I think it would be very unethical to get rid of rent control first. That would just drive up prices. So there's a kind of libertarian paradigm. I don't know if you guys are following me here, but there is a libertarian paradigm that might be possible. And one of the things I think would be really interesting is to create like a SOMA free trade zone, like a little area where we say build to the moon and do it, like experiment with that. Hopefully not an area where anyone would be displaced, so like an area without any current residents, just to run the experiment. But I think that as long as we're locked into regulations that limit supply, we probably better keep rent control in place.
So given that we have an actual economist here, let's make sure to get a professional opinion as well.
Yeah, rent control is a kind of a funny way to help renters. It's kind of a lottery, but it's not a lottery that favors necessarily the more needy residents. It's a lottery based on who was in, who is out, and so it's a kind of a blunt instrument if you want to keep prices down. There's a lot of people who are in rent control and make pretty good money. And there's a lot of people who are not in rent control and don't make a lot of good money. So it's not an ideal instrument. I don't think there is any discussion at the state level or at the local level to change it. I don't see it going anywhere. So we might as well focus on actual policy that we can that are on the table. But it's not like if you had to design a way to help renters, rent control is not the way to do it.
What would be the way to do it?
Well, I think there are two things that can help renter. One thing is kill the demand of housing by killing jobs, and the other thing is increase the supply of housing by increasing housing units in the right places. Certainly not in the Presidio.
So we need to tank the economy and start a free trade zone in Soma, right? That's the takeaway here.
I would favor the latter.
Okay. Why don't you chime in here? We're free ranging now. So specifically, there was this question about. So we have 3 minutes left. So actually, I'm not even going to ask that question. I'm going to ask a much tougher question on the spot, which is I want each of you to recommend one book or film that you think would help people better understand what's going on right now in our city.
The Geography of Jobs by Enrico Moretti.
Nicely done.
Now, I was telling him before, I used that book in my graduate courses, so that was my line too. I would recommend The Metropolitan Revolution by Bruce Katz.
Great.
I'm going to get the title wrong because I read it so long ago. I think it's called The Sale of a City. There's a book that was written that covers all the, the redevelop. Thank you. City for Sale, that covers the redevelopment era, the changes we made. I think it also shows how a lot of you guys heard the term NIMBY a lot today, how some of the anti-development advocacy got built, and it came from a really good place. So I think it's very educational to see how we got to where we are today.
There's a lot I would say. My good friend Carl Vitale, his book, Local Movements, Global. I've been up here for like the lights are on, but Carl Vitale's book, Google it. It's wonderful. It's a history of San Francisco electoral movements. That's quite great.
Ed Glazer, who is an economist at Harvard, has written a couple of years ago a very interesting book called The Triumph of the City. And I think it's not only about San Francisco. It's kind of like a a love story with cities and their history and their dynamism, and so it touches upon some of the love that Sarah was mentioning earlier. But I think it would be a great book for someone who lives in San Francisco to read, because it would show the reader that some of the trends that we're experiencing are not unique to San Francisco. I think one great fault of the public debate in San Francisco is very parochial, very provincial, and it's all focused about the city as if it's the only place on earth. And the reality is that a lot of the trends that are occurring here are reflective of broader global trends that affect cities, from Hong Kong to New York to Sacramento, and certainly outside our borders. And I think it would be a good entertaining book.
Great, thank you. And I assume we can ask you all to share those resources with the organizers and out on so forth. So thank you. This has been a great panel, only slightly marred by my participation. And thank you all for being here.